From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
A new report puts another spotlight on so-called Havana Syndrome, a set of mysterious symptoms being reported by U.S. government security and diplomatic personnel around the world, as No Labels ends its bid for a 2024 unity ticket as an alternative to President Biden and Donald Trump after failing to attract a candidate. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, columnist Alicia Finley and editorial board member Mene Ukwe-Barua. Havana Syndrome has been an issue that has been talked about for years now through the Trump administration as well as the Biden administration. But let's start with a couple clips from a recent 60 Minutes report bringing some new information to light. And the first one here, this is an FBI agent who is being identified using the name Carrie, who says that she was hit with this Havana Syndrome when she was at home in Florida in 2021.
Inside my right ear, it was like a dentist drilling on steroids. That feeling when it gets too close to your eardrum, it's like that, times 10. It was like a high-pitched metallic drilling noise, and it knocked me forward at like a 45-degree angle this way.
She says she was by a window in her laundry room.
My right ear was line of sight to that window while this thing was happening in my ear. I immediately felt pressure and pain started coursing from inside my right ear, down my jaw, down my neck, and into my chest.
At the same time, FBI agent Carrie told us the battery in her phone began to swell until it broke the case. Finally, she passed out on a couch.
I felt like I had early Alzheimer's. Short-term memory, long-term memory, confusing memories, multitasking. My baseline changed. I was not the same person.
And here's a clip of attorney Mark Zaid, who represents multiple agents of the FBI, the CIA, and employees of the State Department who say they were hit with similar symptoms.
There are dozens of CIA cases that have happened domestically, that is at least believed. And we're not even just talking about physical manifestation. We're talking about evidence of computer issues in the midst of the incident, where computer screens just literally stop working or go flicker on and off. There are other FBI agents and personnel, not just agents, analysts. I represent one other FBI person who was impacted in Miami. And I also know of FBI personnel who believe they were hit overseas in the last decade. The one thread that I know of with the FBI personnel that is common among most, if not all, of my clients, other than the family members connected to the employee, was they were all doing something relating to Russia.
Alicia, what do you make of this? The Journal's editorial board recently wrote a piece saying that the 60 Minutes report should prompt some more answers from the government, that it has been too dismissive of these claims. What's your view of this, and what do we know actually about this Havana Syndrome?
So the Havana Syndrome is actually dubbed that, or gets its name after it was discovered or documented that government personnel at the U.S. Embassy in Cuba in 2016 started suffering these kind of mysterious neurological symptoms and conditions. Tinnitus, which is ringing in the ear, vertigo, headache, dizziness, cognitive dysfunction, to the point that the FBI agent just mentioned feeling like lapses in short-term memory, like similar to Alzheimer's. And more victims over the years, I'll call them victims, started reporting similar symptoms, and they span different government agencies. There was a Commerce Department official that was involved in diplomacy, FBI, CIA, a lot of them involved in intelligence, but many of them were also involved in looking at Russia or involved in Russian affairs. And so the U.S. government has commissioned a number of reports, and the intelligence agencies, the intelligence bureaucracy, which, by the way, is vast, it spans many agencies in the government, have commissioned reports and studied this. And those that at least have come out have basically said, oh, there's nothing to see here. We can't really pin down or identify a cause, but it's probably unlikely to be due to any kind of foreign adversary, notwithstanding all the circumstantial evidence suggesting that. They're basically saying because the effects or the symptoms of the intelligence officers, and again, there are some 1,500 cases now that have been reported, because the symptoms are kind of diffuse, and the biological studies that have been done, we can't really pin down any actually neurological damage, that therefore, maybe it's all in their heads, like the Salem witch trials, and actually they've gotten some support from that from some social psychologists who say that this is basically just mass hysteria.
There's a recent report from the National Institutes of Health that looked at about 80 of these cases. And here is reading from the NIH news release. Using advanced imaging techniques and in-depth clinical assessments, a research team at the National Institutes of Health found no significant evidence of MRI detectable brain injury, nor differences in most clinical measures compared to controls among a group of federal employees who experienced anomalous health incidents, AHIs, which is how this is often referred to in government documents. And Monet, one theory that's being advanced is that these attacks could be the result of some kind of Russian energy weapon. And on one hand, I would not put anything past Vladimir Putin. If we find out in some years that there have been attacks by Russian agents on U.S. personnel using some kind of secret weapon that Russia developed, I don't think that I would be surprised in the least. On the other hand, people have all sorts of strange health episodes throughout their lives. People have all sorts of opinions about their health that we might call medically unorthodox. And if you have thousands of people working for the government, hundreds of thousands of people working for the government maybe, who are concerned that they hear these stories and they think that any day they might be hit by some kind of Russian ray, they might have an unrelated health event, a mini stroke or something like that, and they might think that was it. This is what I have been waiting for. And by the way, these are not mutually exclusive explanations. You could have one group of people who was actually attacked using some kind of Russian weapon, and you could have another group of people who had some sort of normal health event, mental health crisis, and those people think they were attacked by the same Russian weapon. And so it gets pretty difficult to tease out what is actually going on here.
I think that's true. It is really difficult to put together all of the testimonies of these people who claim to have experienced these attacks and sort them into the most credible accounts, and also to establish a definitive record of what might this be. I think if you look at the NIH reports, they do say that the MRIs that were applied to some of these people who reported being attacked by this supposed device didn't reveal any definitive sign of stroke or severe trauma. And I think that on the one hand, is revealing about what the nature of the injury might be. It isn't causing some kind of clear physical damage to the brain tissue of these people. But I don't think that necessarily invalidates the notion that there could be some kind of temporary physical effect that's taking place from some kind of energy pulse directed at these people, which is affecting their brains in some way, making them experience a temporary spike of sensation, and then possibly leading to some kind of disorientation that just isn't related to a hard physical injury on their brain tissue. And so I would hope that the studies are continuing, that there are methods of investigating this beyond MRI technology. But I do think that there's reason to think that it isn't merely mass hysteria. I think that there are instances, certainly in history, when you've had the general public understanding that there's an illness going around, being wary of it, and then starting to read too much into their own symptoms and self-diagnose. There are instances when that has happened through broadcast, etc. But I think that it's very rare to have, among a relatively small group of trained credential experts all reporting these symptoms, particularly when a disproportionate number of them do have the connection to Russia in terms of what their portfolio was. There seems to be enough evidence that these people are credible. Those testimonies that we heard in the clips sound very credible, I think, to the average listener. And so the government should be leaning in the direction of trusting its own employees. And even if there isn't anything hard documented in terms of what they're experiencing, should be continuing the search, treating it very seriously, and preparing to retaliate if we do have evidence to link it to Russian attacks.
Hang tight. We'll be right back in a moment. Welcome back. A couple things that come to mind on the point about getting more information out, and especially more information from the government. One is the allegations, including those that you heard in those clips we played from 60 Minutes, of electronic and physical changes to a cell phone battery or a computer screen, something like that, that is reportedly coming along with these physical effects, because that's something that could shed light on what's going on here. And notable to me that there was a claim that there was an effect on a cell phone, and the 60 Minutes report, as far as I saw, did not show the cell phone or provide any more backup on that. Two is, Alicia, if there is some sort of energy weapon that is being deployed against U.S. personnel, I start to wonder whether there are similar reports in Ukraine, in Germany, in the UK, places where Russian agents have committed or attempted assassinations, or among Russian dissidents. I mean, I know our intelligence and reporting out of that country is limited in some respects, but I imagine if Russia has some kind of secret weapon that we're unaware of, that it would be deployed against other people other than American agents.
I think that that's very possible. And the Russians, on the other hand, could just be gaslighting the Americans and saying, see, this is what we could do if you guys escalate in some fashion. And just going back to that National Institutes of Health study, there were numerous shortcomings in this study and that were actually pointed out in an accompanying editorial in the journal American Medical Association. And for one, just because there was no actual damage shown on MRIs in the brain, that doesn't necessarily mean that there wasn't actual physical damage that was done. In fact, many of these scans were taken over years after the symptom onset. And what we know is that when there's brain damage, for instance, from a concussion, actually, that doesn't always necessarily show up months or years later, even though there is actual damage done. There are certain actually blood proteins that can measure. And in fact, what they have found in other studies is that many of these victims have actually shown a spike in these certain proteins that do evince damage. We also know that if there were some kind of energy weapon, an electromagnetic pulse, which is now one of the culprits that is being speculated, that can affect all kinds of neurological sensations, neurological symptoms. And we know that because there are actually scientists who are studying how to use these kind of electromagnetic impulses to actually treat various conditions without actually doing damage to the brain. But we do know that this is a plausible explanation, notwithstanding the NIH's studies, which I think were kind of, one, not just flawed, but really just kind of dismissive of these patients' concerns. And I think we've seen that in other contexts where the NIH, at least in the editorial in the JAMA, also mentioned that long COVID and chronic fatigue syndrome are a couple of other areas in which they haven't necessarily been able to pin down an exact cause in the NIH despite studying this. But nonetheless, there are patients clearly suffering with physical symptoms of something, and more study is really warranted, just like there is here.
But on the point about whether the government owes the public more information, Monet, it wouldn't be the first time to find out after the fact that the government was not telling the entire truth, didn't want to follow the leads down the path and find out information that would be alarming to Americans, alarming to American personnel, might make people feel like we are more vulnerable to some of our adversaries than most people feel going about their daily lives.
Absolutely. I think that the investigation into the origins of COVID is actually a good comparable story, in the sense that there was very clear evidence early on when it became clear that COVID originated in Wuhan, which is where the Institute of Virology in China is, that it likely had some amount of government involvement on the part of China. And yet we rarely did see the federal investigators take that very seriously, at least in the public eye. And part of that is probably knowing that they don't want to have to engage in the difficult diplomacy of actually holding China accountable for its actions. And obviously part of it also is the American complicity on the part of Anthony Fauci and some of these other public health administrators who might have participated in funding or at least sponsoring some of the research that was done. And so there is certainly a precedent for the government being unwilling to look down certain paths because they fear what they'll be held accountable for doing if the truth becomes known. And it's possible that they don't want to be faced with the opportunity of having to retaliate or having to admit that we've been unable to protect our own personnel against the Russian threat.